Hey there, I'm Dr. Carr, and I'm here to help you make smarter choices to live a healthier life. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I've been seeing quite a bit recently. It was a supplement or compound I really wasn't super familiar with up until recently, and that's berberine. And if you've spent any time in any health and longevity podcasts or on Twitter, you've probably heard about this compound. I know Dr. Rhonda Patrick has been talking about it quite a bit. And really, people are basically calling it nature's metformin, that it can help in tremendous ways with blood glucose control. And the question is, does it really live up to the hype? Is it as good as everyone's touting it to be? So today I'm just going to be discussing kind of what berberine is, what are the potential health benefits. It's been compared to other things that can help with longevity like resveratrol, how it compares to metformin, and what the researchers are saying about it. And along with that, I think it's going to be important to touch on, like with any supplement or substance you take, what are the risk factors that are associated with it? And so with that, let's dive in. So what is berberine? It's basically an alkaloid, and it's found in plants like barberry, golden seal, Coptis chinesis, which in traditional Chinese medicine is known as huanglian. And here's the thing: if you've never tried it, just be warned, it tastes unbelievably bitter. But it's not a new substance, and it's been used for centuries for treating things like infections and GI or gastrointestinal issues. Now, here's the cool thing about it, and this is why I think it's been getting so much interest lately, and that's its ability to help to regulate blood sugar and lipids. And as I mentioned in the intro, a lot of the articles you'll see, they discuss it as though it's nature's metformin, which, if you're not aware, it's basically the go-to medication for helping to regulate blood sugar in people with type 2 diabetes. And so you have to think, if this compound berberine is a natural way of doing the same thing as metformin, or at least a similar thing, then obviously that's pretty big news. And so again, I think that's why it's been getting so much attention recently. But as with any substance or supplement, I think it's really important to look at the research. Let's see what the research says. Is it as helpful as everyone's claiming it to be? Does the data and the studies, do they back up the claims? Because again, no matter how natural something is, there's always going to be nuance. So here's the good news. There are actual solid studies out there that point to the use of berberine as a way of lowering blood sugar as well as lipids. Now, the big question is, how does that really translate into longevity as an endpoint? There's still not a lot of solid data that talks about the use of berberine in terms of longevity and anti-aging. So if that's your primary endpoint and really what you're going after, I definitely suggest you exercise caution before you decide to jump on the berberine bandwagon and make it, kind of part of your go-to for your anti-aging and longevity plan. So how does this plant extract work? So one of the major ways is something called AMPK activation. Basically, think of AMPK as your cell's energy thermostat. So it tells your cells when to conserve energy and when to burn energy. And so when you're healthy and your cells sense that they need more energy, it causes this AMPK to become activated or switched on. And that really sets in motion a chain reaction. The result is that your muscles become more effective at taking up glucose and using them for metabolism. It also helps to slow down your liver's glucose production. And lastly, it stops your body from making as much fat. So basically, you start burning fuel instead of hoarding it, which is really what you want in the setting of high blood sugar or insulin resistance. Now, you may be thinking, if you know anything about metformin, that this sounds an awful lot like how metformin works. And if you're thinking that, you'd be correct, because metformin also acts in the mitochondria to help to kind of reduce some of the mitochondrial function. And that creates an energy deficit, which triggers AMPK. And what the research seems to suggest is that berberine is doing something very similar. Plus, it also has this additional benefit of regulating the gut microbiome and helping to influence which bacteria are going to thrive. And the net effect of this is that it basically helps to reduce inflammation as well as improve insulin sensitivity. And a good way to think of this is basically it's like a mild exercise signal within your cells. And so it's kind of like a mini stressor. And it's telling your cells, when they need to adapt, when they need to burn more glucose, when they need to get stronger. And our bodies love these signals. And that's true whether this is coming from fasting or exercise or from compounds like berberine and metformin. Now, the important question is, in terms of human studies, does it actually work? And there are a lot of clinical trials, specifically from China, that show that berberine can significantly lower blood glucose, especially in type 2 diabetics. In fact, several of them have actually looked at taking 1,500 milligrams of berberine a day and comparing it to the standard dose of metformin. And the cool thing is that the research actually shows that the improvement in your hemoglobin A1C, which is, again, without getting too technical, it's a way of measuring what your blood sugar has been in the previous several months, as well as your fasting glucose. They found that between the berberine treatment group and the metformin group, the results are pretty similar. And in fact, some of the patients actually had better improvement in their lipid profiles, and this is specifically their LDL, with the use of berberine versus metformin. What they found is it could be up to a 20% improvement in your LDL levels. And that's definitely not trivial. But I think it's important that we exercise some caution here, because even though, again, it sounds like based upon these studies that I was just discussing and the research, it looks like there's a lot of benefits from berberine as it relates to metformin. These are still smaller studies. And if you look at the broader body of research, we just don't have as much data and not as much long-term data showing its efficacy. The reality is metformin has been studied for decades in medicine. And so we have a lot of research and a lot of data that we can point to. Berberine, on the other hand, especially in the Western world, we just don't have as much information to support its use as it compares to metformin. That being said, there was a meta-analysis of over 20 randomized controlled trials that definitely showed the benefit of berberine, specifically with the glucose regulation and lipid improvement endpoints. And that's a lot more than can be said for a lot of miracle supplements that you might commonly hear touted online. And for patients who are currently diabetic and having their blood sugar managed by a physician, before you go out and start taking berberine, I would definitely talk to them, because particularly if you're combining it with other medications, it can have a pretty dramatic impact on lowering your blood sugar, and there's a lot of consequences associated with that. And beyond blood sugar and lipid management, I think it would be helpful to talk about some of the other effects from berberine, specifically on the heart as well as the gut. So in terms of heart health, at least with berberine, we see improvements not just in LDL, as I mentioned earlier, but also triglycerides, blood pressure, and even possibly in arrhythmias. And in terms of studies, there was an interesting animal study. They were looking at rabbits, and what they found is that rabbits who were basically placed on a high cholesterol diet and taking berberine actually had fewer arterial plaques. And for humans, there were some studies that show that it can improve heart failure metrics. So things like increasing your ejection fraction, which is basically how much blood your heart pumps out with each beat. And one way that may be helpful to think of berberine in your bloodstream is basically like a traffic cop. So it's helping to clear out obstructions and things like, traffic jams like cholesterol. And then additionally, it encourages better blood flow. And furthermore, it helps to set speed limits for things like glucose. But again, it's just a traffic cop. It's not the full police force here. So depending on your medical conditions and the severity of things like diabetes or heart disease, while berberine may be, interesting to explore with your physician, it's likely not going to replace the other medications you're currently taking. And in terms of your gut, basically think of it like the sheriff. It helps to rein in or reduce the bad bacteria, influences things so that you have more good bacteria, and ultimately reduces gut inflammation. Interestingly, some patients will report GI upset and things like diarrhea while taking berberine, while on the other hand, there's patients who say it actually improved their overall digestive health. And basically, the reason for this is because it's so poorly absorbed through the gut, it really interacts with that gut microbiome. And so that can be great, or it can really cause problems depending on what that microbiome looks like. So does that mean that berberine is going to increase your lifespan? The simple answer is that in humans, we just don't know yet. There are studies that show that it can help to improve lifespan in things like worms and fruit flies. But again, those same studies just don't exist for humans. And in some rodent studies they've done, they've actually shown that it definitely improved health markers. So basically less inflammation, better overall mitochondrial function, and then lastly, improvements in insulin resistance. And so based upon this, it's reasonable to assume that this would lead to improved healthy aging. But the reality is, forget humans and animals, we don't even have research yet to show that it's going to cause any significant improvement long-term. That being said, anything that has been shown to improve your overall metabolic health, reduce inflammation, and then also help to keep your insulin in check is likely going to have an impact on your overall health span. And so While this may not necessarily be adding years to your life, it should be adding quality to the years of your life that you have remaining. And lastly, the fact that berberine is shown to activate AMPK, which we know plays a role in longevity, would suggest that, in the future, we should see some, interesting studies that support its use as something to add lifespan as well. Now, one of the questions I get sometimes from patients is, okay, well, should I be taking berberine? What about resveratrol? Or maybe I want to go on metformin, or how about NMN? And so I think it's important to kind of talk about how each of these medications could potentially help you before ultimately deciding which one is the right choice. Now, in terms of metformin, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big benefits of this drug is that it's been around for decades, and most, if not all, physicians have pretty decent or extensive experience with the drug. And that means knowing kind of what the dose response is going to be and what side effects a patient might experience. And some of those side effects could include things like GI upset. It can lead to B12 deficiency. And then particularly in patients that have kidney problems, it can result in acidosis. Now, in terms of resveratrol, many of you are likely familiar with it from the whole kind of red wine phenomenon, as it helps to activate sirtuins. And while it could help for metabolic syndrome, there's still not a lot of really strong research, at least as it relates to humans. And it's also recognized to have really good antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, but not nearly the same benefit in terms of blood sugar control as berberine. And the next is NMN, which is basically it's a precursor for NAD, which ultimately helps to fuel sirtuins and other longevity enzymes. And NMN can improve NAD in aged tissues, which could help to improve your energy balance and any kind of metabolic function, but it's not really known for slashing blood sugar or improving lipids. Really, you should think of it as kind of like cellular rejuvenation. And so it may have some potential longevity benefits, but most of the research is primarily in mice versus humans. And lastly, berberine, as we've been discussing, which definitely has good evidence to suggest that it can help to control blood sugar as well as lipids. And then additionally, it has these impacts on the gut microbiome as well as being anti-inflammatory. And while it's poorly absorbed, as I mentioned earlier, that could actually be a feature, not really a bug, because ultimately it helps to keep it in the gut so it can have a bigger impact there. So let's say you've decided you want to take berberine. Here's what the research really says in terms of the dosing. So first, you want to take somewhere between 900 and 1500 milligrams a day, divided into 3 doses. So basically breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And patients find that taking it with a meal is really helpful to deal with that, post-meal glucose spike. And in terms of side effects, the main ones are going to be the GI upset that I was discussing earlier. And this could include everything from diarrhea to constipation. And so if that's something you're concerned about, what I recommend doing is definitely starting with a smaller dose and then just kind of ratcheting it up over time. And in terms of quality, it's really important, and this goes not just for berberine, but really for any supplement, that you're going to a high-end distributor. And so for me, I use, Designs for Health. They've got really good high-end supplements. Look for supplements that have undergone independent third-party testing, because you want to make sure you're actually getting the benefit and that the dosing is consistent. And some folks, just because they don't want to upset the GI flora too much, actually will cycle on and off. So they'll go on it for 2 months and then come off for, a month. And I'm sure you can find protocols online. There's not a ton of research to back this up. So most of it's going to be anecdotal evidence, but again, that's something else you may want to keep in mind. And lastly, you really want to make sure, and this is, particularly important if you're on other medications already, that it's not going to interact with the drugs you're on, because it can really, depending on if it's a medication that's metabolized through the liver, it can result in problems if you're taking berberine as well. And this is particularly true if you're on any kind of immunosuppressant medications or blood thinners, as well as other diabetes meds, as I mentioned earlier. So I would definitely talk to your doctor if you're on other medications or thinking about going on berberine. And lastly, if you are breastfeeding or pregnant, I would definitely caution you against using berberine, just because it can cause neonatal jaundice. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're on any medications already, please talk to your doctor about the use of something like berberine. The goal here is synergy, not side effects. But lastly, let's be clear here. As I mentioned earlier, again, we have a lot of smaller studies, some in humans, to suggest benefit. We've got some bigger meta-analyses that show benefit, and we've got animal studies that show benefit. But what we're lacking at this point is that we don't have those long-term, decades-long studies like we have with, pharmaceuticals like metformin to show the benefit of a supplement like berberine long-term. And so again, there's a lot of hope there. And I think that we are going to, in the coming years, especially as berberine is getting more attention and with more folks interested in health and longevity, I'd expect some of that research is forthcoming. But I just want to make it clear that right now, it would be tough for me to say, oh, absolutely take berberine and it's going to add years to your life. And going back to what I mentioned earlier in the side effects, while it's generally safe and tolerated well at high doses, it's important to keep in mind that it can have really dramatic GI side effects for some patients. So to kind of wrap things up, berberine's main claim to fame is improvement in insulin sensitivity, glucose control, as well as the lowering of lipids. And it does this by activating AMPK and basically turns your cells into, for lack of a better term, like a glucose burning machines. And as I mentioned, it's very commonly compared to metformin, which mechanistically, they're very similar. But as I also mentioned, we've got a lot more data on metformin. It's a medication that's been out for decades. It's been well studied. That being said, for a supplement, berberine is pretty impressive. And beyond sugar and fat, berberine has been shown to reduce inflammation, reduce harmful gut bacteria, and help to preserve mitochondria. And while these are generally positive signs for aging, to talk about it like a guaranteed anti-aging pill is just a little bit too premature at this point. As far as dosing, aim for 900 to 1500 milligrams a day, divided into 3 doses, preferably taking it with meals. And as I mentioned, you can also adjust the dosing based upon how it interacts with your stomach. And also then make sure you exercise extreme caution if you're already on other medications, as well as if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. And it's also really important to remember that lifestyle matters here. So do I think that berberine is a great adjunct for someone who's already fairly metabolically healthy? Sure. But it's not going to move the needle in the same way that the other things that we know are so important as in terms of metabolic levers are going to do. Things like diet and exercise and good sleep. And so, while again, it could be something nice to add in if you already are optimized in those areas, it's not going to fix, a poor diet of soda and donuts. And lastly, it's really important to be realistic here. As I mentioned, there are definitely some, very promising studies, not just in animals, but in humans as well, to suggest that berberine is going to be helpful in terms of overall, anti-aging and longevity. We just don't have these big studies yet to definitively say, yes, absolutely, this medication or this supplement is really going to have a huge impact long-term. I'm hopeful, but I just don't want to get you, I'd be careful and caution you about, some of the hype that you may hear around this supplement. And lastly, the future potential. As I've mentioned, we have very promising research, both in terms of animal studies, as well as some smaller human studies to suggest that berberine could be beneficial. But again, we don't have these really big, robust, longitudinal studies to show that it's going to improve, overall lifespan and or health span. And so do I think it's a great metabolic ally? Absolutely. But I just would caution you about getting too excited until we have more data to back up some of the claims that you may hear. Personally, I think berberine is one of the more interesting natural options in terms of your overall metabolic health. It's not a magic bullet, but really, none of these compounds are. But if you struggle with high blood sugar or lipid management, it's definitely worth considering. Just make sure you keep your doctor in the loop. Again, I'm Dr. Carr. I'm here to help you make smarter choices to live a healthier life. If you found this video helpful, definitely hit like or subscribe or share it with someone else you think may find it helpful as well. And continue to tune in for additional videos and content on overall health and longevity. Thank you.